I married a 52-year-old man when I was just 17, and on our wedding night, when I saw what the good Lord had given him between his legs, I thought I was gonna die right there in that cold bedroom. That thing was so big I couldn't even look at it without my hands shaking like autumn leaves. My name is Clementine Harper. I'm 72 years old, and folks round here in Bucksnort know me as the quiet woman who brings peach cobbler to every church supper and never misses a Sunday service. They see me tending my little garden, waving from my front porch, and they think they know my story. But honey, they don't know nothing about what happened behind closed doors all those years ago. I've carried this burden in my chest for over 50 years now, pressing down on my heart like a stone I can't move. Some nights, when the crickets are singing and the moon is hanging low over these Tennessee hills, I sit on this same porch where I'm talking to you now, and I remember every single detail of that time when I was nothing more than a scared girl thrown into a man's world with no choice but to survive it. Today, I'm finally ready to tell you the whole truth about what happened when my daddy sold me off like livestock, about the man with those tortured eyes who became my husband, and about how God worked in ways I never could have imagined. This story needs to be told, not just for me, but for anyone who's ever felt trapped with no way out. So settle in with me, won't you? Walk with me through these memories that still make my old heart race. Help me carry this story that's been weighing on my soul for far too long. Growing up in rural Tennessee in the late 1960s wasn't like the world young folks know today. Back then, a girl's future wasn't hers to decide. It belonged to her daddy first, then to whatever man he chose to hand her over to. I was 17, still playing with my mama's old rag dolls when I wasn't helping with the washing, when my whole life got decided for me over a cup of coffee and a handshake I wasn't even allowed to witness. My daddy, Ezekiel Foster, was a hard man worn down by years of trying to make a living off stubborn Tennessee soil. We lived on a small patch of land about 3 miles outside Bucksnort, in a house that leaked when it rained and creaked like old bones when the wind picked up. Mama, Beulah, spent most of her days coughing into her handkerchief. That persistent cough that started after my baby brother died and never quite left her chest. I had dreams back then, silly as they might sound now. I wanted to work at the Five and Dime in town, maybe save up enough money to get one of those pretty dresses I'd seen in the Sears catalog. I was sweet on Caleb Winchester, a boy just 4 years older than me who worked on the Murphy farm down the road. Caleb had gentle hands and a smile that made my stomach flutter like butterfly wings. We'd meet sometimes by the old oak tree that marked the property line, talking about maybe getting married someday when he'd saved enough to buy his own little piece of land. But I was foolish to think my heart mattered in any of this. See, our farm was failing, and Daddy owed money to half the county. The drought that summer had killed most of our crops, and that bank man had been coming round with papers that made Daddy's face turn red as a tomato. That's when Augustus Hartwell started showing up at our dinner table. Augustus was a prosperous man, owned a big spread over in Meadowbrook County with more cattle than I could count. He was a widower. His first wife had run off years before, or so folks said, and at 52, he was older than my own daddy. When he looked at me across a worn kitchen table, his eyes held something that made my skin crawl, like he was measuring me for something I didn't understand. The first time he came calling, I thought he was there to talk business with Daddy about maybe buying some of our land. I served him coffee in Mama's good china and tried to stay invisible in the corner, but I could feel his gaze following me around that cramped kitchen like a shadow I couldn't shake. It was Mama who finally told me the truth, her voice barely above a whisper as we folded laundry together on a humid August afternoon. Her hands were shaking worse than usual when she said, "Clementine, honey, your daddy's made arrangements for your future. Hartwell has asked for your hand, and your daddy's already given his blessing." I dropped the sheet I was holding, watching it fall to the dust like my whole world crashing down. "But, Mama," I whispered, "what about Caleb? What about what I want?" She couldn't even look at me when she answered, "What we want don't matter much when the bills need paying. Sugar, your daddy says it's the only way to keep us from losing everything." That night, I snuck out to meet Caleb by our oak tree one last time. When I told him what was happening, he held me so tight I could barely breathe, and I felt his tears mixing with mine in the darkness. He promised he'd find a way to stop it. Said he'd talk to his boss about advancing him some money, anything to change my daddy's mind. But deep down, we both knew the truth. In our world, a man's word was his bond, and once hands were shaken and agreements made, there wasn't no going back. I was going to become Mrs. Augustus Hartwell, whether my heart wanted it or not. The wedding was set for September 15th, just 3 weeks away. 3 weeks to say goodbye to everything I'd ever known, everything I'd ever dreamed of. 3 weeks before I'd have to share a bed with a man whose very presence made my skin feel like it was trying to crawl right off my bones. And it was then, sitting in that kitchen with the acceptance papers spread across the table like a death sentence, that I realized my childhood was over. I wasn't Clementine Foster anymore. I was about to become property, passed from one man to another like a piece of furniture or a milk cow. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have possibly imagined, was that my wedding night would be just the beginning of a story so strange and terrible that even now, all these years later, I sometimes wonder if it was all just a nightmare I never woke up from. And it was that everything started falling apart, piece by piece, like a house built on sand finally meeting its flood. The 3 weeks before my wedding crawled by like molasses in January. Every morning I'd wake up hoping it was all just a bad dream, but there was Augustus Hartwell, showing up at our door regular as clockwork, bringing gifts I never asked for, and talking to Daddy about things like I wasn't even in the room. He'd bring me ribbons for my hair, always in colors I didn't like, and sometimes a piece of hard candy that tasted like peppermint, and false promises. The way he'd watch me eat that candy, his pale blue eyes never leaving my mouth, made my stomach turn sour. There was something hungry in his gaze, something that reminded me of the way our old tomcat used to watch the baby birds before he'd pounce. Augustus wasn't an ugly man, I'll give him that. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with silver threading through his dark hair and hands that looked like they'd never known a day's honest work. Even though folks said he ran one of the most successful cattle operations in 3 counties, his clothes were always clean and pressed, and he smelled like expensive soap and something else I couldn't place, something sharp and medicinal that made me think of the doctor's office. But it was his voice that unsettled me most. He spoke real soft and careful, like he was handling something fragile. But underneath that gentleness was something else, something that made the hair on my arms stand up. When he'd say my name, Clementine, darling, it sounded like he was tasting it, rolling it around in his mouth like he owned it already. The strangest thing was how he'd sometimes stop talking mid-sentence and just stare off into nothing, his whole face going blank like somebody had blown out a candle behind his eye. Then he'd shake his head real quick and come back to whatever we were discussing. But those moments left me feeling like I'd glimpsed something I wasn't supposed to see. One afternoon, about a week before the wedding, Augustus asked Daddy if he could take me for a walk around our property. Daddy agreed, of course. He would have agreed if Augustus asked to take me to the moon by then. We walked in silence for a while. my feet crunching through the dry corn stalks, until we reached the fence line where our land met the Murphy farm. That's when Augustus stopped walking and turned to look at me with those pale eyes of his. "Clementine," he said, and his voice was different somehow, softer but more intense. "I want you to know that I understand this arrangement might not be what you would have chosen for yourself." I was so surprised to hear him acknowledge that. I actually looked up at his face instead of keeping my eyes on the ground like Mama had taught me. There was something almost vulnerable in his expression, like he was trying to tell me something important, but didn't know how. "But I want you to know," he continued, reaching out to touch my cheek with fingers that were surprisingly gentle, "that I will take care of you. You'll want for nothing as my wife. You'll have a beautiful home, pretty dresses, anything your heart desires." What I wanted to say was that my heart desired Caleb Winchester and a life I got to choose for myself, but instead I just nodded and whispered, "Yes, sir." That's when he did something that chilled me to the bone. He smiled, really smiled for the first time since I'd met him, and for just a second, his whole face transformed. But it wasn't a kind smile or a happy one. It was the smile of a man who had just won something he'd been wanting for a very long time. "There's just one thing I need you to understand, Clementine," he said, his fingers still touching my face. "Once you're my wife, you belong to me completely, not to your parents, not to anyone else who might have filled your head with silly notions. Just to me. Do you understand?" I nodded again, but something in the way he said belong made my blood run cold. It was like he wasn't talking about marriage at all, but about ownership, pure and simple. As we walked back to the house, Augustus seemed to relax, even humming a little tune under his breath. But I noticed something that made my skin prickle with unease. When we passed by the Murphy farm, he turned his head to look across their fields with an expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't until later that I realized what I'd seen in his face. It was recognition, like he knew something about that place, about the people who lived there, that he hadn't shared with anyone. That night, as I lay in my narrow bed listening to Mama's cough echoing through the thin walls, I tried to convince myself that maybe marriage to Augustus wouldn't be so terrible. Maybe he really would take care of me like he promised. Maybe I could learn to be content with pretty dresses and a big house, even if my heart belonged somewhere else. But deep down, in that place where your soul whispers truths you don't want to hear, I knew that Augustus Hartwell was hiding something dark behind those careful words and false smiles. I just had no idea how dark, or how much deeper this whole thing went than a simple business arrangement between two men. I didn't know that before the week was over, I'd discover the real reason Augustus Hartwell wanted to marry me. And it had nothing to do with loneliness or even desire. It had everything to do with a secret he'd been carrying for 20 years, and a debt he thought marrying me might finally help him pay. I didn't know that my wedding night was about to become the least of my worries. The night before my wedding, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that strange look Augustus had given the Murphy farm, and something was gnawing at me like a splinter I couldn't dig out. Around midnight, when the house was quiet except for Daddy's snoring and Mama's occasional cough, I slipped out of bed and crept to the kitchen window that faced toward town. That's when I saw something that changed everything. There was a figure walking up our dirt road in the moonlight, and even from a distance, I could tell it was Caleb Winchester. My heart jumped like a rabbit, thinking maybe he'd found a way to stop this wedding after all. But as he got closer, I could see something was wrong. He was walking funny, kind of stumbling, and when he finally reached our porch, I could see blood on his shirt. I eased the front door open real quiet and stepped outside in my nightgown. Caleb looked up at me with eyes that were wild and scared, and I could see a nasty cut above his left eyebrow that was still bleeding. He told me he'd been jumped by 3 men on his way home from work, beaten pretty bad, and warned to stay away from me and my family. But that wasn't the worst part. He said one of the men had mentioned Augustus Hartwell by name, said I was already spoken for, and that Caleb would be smart to forget I ever existed. My blood went cold as Winter Creek water. Augustus had sent men to hurt Caleb. This wasn't just about Daddy's debts or some business arrangement. Augustus wanted me specifically, and he was willing to use violence to make sure he got me. But there was more. Caleb grabbed my hands with his own shaking ones and told me something that made my knees nearly buckle. He said while they were beating him, one of the men had let something slip about Augustus's first wife, Carmen. She hadn't run off like everybody thought. According to what Caleb overheard, she'd tried to leave Augustus once before, and bad things had happened to people who helped her. The way Caleb's voice shook when he told me this, I knew he was scared not just for himself, but for me. He begged me to run away with him that very night, said we could make it to his cousin's place in Kentucky before anybody noticed we were gone. For a moment, standing there in the moonlight with blood on the boy I loved and terror in my heart, I almost said yes. But then I thought about Mama's cough getting worse every day, about Daddy's bent shoulders and the bank papers on our kitchen table. If I ran, Augustus would take back his offer, and my family would lose everything. They might even end up homeless, and Mama was too sick to survive living rough. I realized then that I wasn't just trapped by circumstance. I was trapped by love. My love for my family was going to force me into a marriage with a man who might be dangerous, might even be a killer. That night marked the moment I stopped being a girl with choices and became a woman with impossible burdens. As Caleb disappeared back into the darkness, limping and defeated, I felt something inside me die. Not my spirit exactly, but my innocence, my belief that good things happen to good people and that love could conquer everything. I went back inside and sat at the kitchen table until dawn, staring at those bank papers and trying to understand how my life had become a chess game where I was just a pawn. Augustus hadn't chosen me because he loved me or even because he found me pretty. He'd chosen me because he could, because I came with a price my daddy was desperate enough to accept. But the most terrifying realization came as the sun started creeping through our kitchen window. If Augustus was willing to have Caleb beaten just for talking to me, what would he do to me once I was legally his wife? Alone in his house, with no witnesses and no protection? I understood then that my wedding night wasn't going to be about consummating a marriage. It was going to be about establishing ownership. And whatever had happened to Carmen, whatever had made her so desperate to escape that she'd risk everything to get away from him, was probably going to happen to me too. The wedding was in 8 hours, and I finally understood that I wasn't walking down the aisle toward a new life. I was walking toward something that might destroy me completely, and there wasn't a soul in the world who could save me from it. As I sat there watching the sun come up on what might be my last day of freedom, I made myself a promise. Whatever Augustus Hartwell had planned for me, whatever dark secrets he was hiding, I was going to survive it. Somehow, some way, I was going to live through whatever was coming and find a way back to the light. I just had no idea how much darkness I'd have to walk through first, or that the biggest shock of my life was still waiting for me on the other side of those wedding vows. The wedding itself passed like a fever dream. I remember walking down the aisle of Bucksnort's little white church in Mama's altered wedding dress, feeling like I was floating outside my own body, watching some other girl get married to a stranger. Augustus stood at the altar in his best black suit, and when I finally reached him, He took my trembling hand in his steady one with what looked like satisfaction. In those pale blue eyes, Pastor Williams spoke about love and devotion and honoring your husband. But all I could think about was Caleb's bruised face and the blood on his shirt. When it came time to say my vows, my voice came out so quiet that folks in the back pews had to lean forward to hear me. Augustus's voice, on the other hand, rang out clear and strong, like he was claiming victory instead of taking a wife. The reception was held in the church fellowship hall, and I sat at the head table picking at a piece of wedding cake that tasted like sawdust in my mouth. Augustus kept his hand on my knee the whole time, his fingers pressing through the fabric of my dress like he was reminding me that I belonged to him now. Every time someone came to congratulate us, he'd squeeze a little tighter, and I'd have to fight not to flinch away. When it was time to leave for his house, my new home, Augustus helped me into his black Cadillac with a gentleness that might have fooled anyone watching. But I could feel the tension in his grip, the barely controlled excitement that made my stomach turn over and over. The drive to his farm in Meadowbrook County took nearly an hour, and we didn't speak the entire time. Augustus hummed that same little tune I'd heard him humming before, and I stared out the window at the Tennessee countryside rolling past, thinking this might be the last time I saw the world from a position of relative safety. His house was bigger than I'd imagined, a 2-story white farmhouse with a wraparound porch and shutters that needed painting. But there was something unwelcoming about it, something that made it feel more like a prison than a home. Maybe it was the way the windows seemed to stare down at us like empty eyes, or how the whole place sat isolated on its hill with no neighboring houses in sight. Augustus carried my small suitcase to the front door, and when he opened it, I was hit with the smell of the place, that same medicinal scent I'd noticed on him, but stronger, mixed with something musty and old. He showed me through the downstairs rooms, his hand never leaving the small of my back, pointing out the parlor and the dining room and the kitchen like he was giving a tour to a visitor instead of showing his new wife her home. Then he led me upstairs to what would be our bedroom, and that's when the reality of my situation hit me like a physical blow. The room was large and dominated by a massive 4-poster bed that seemed to take up half the space. Heavy curtains blocked most of the evening light, making everything feel dim and oppressive. Augustus closed the door behind us with a soft click that sounded as final as a coffin lid closing. When he turned to look at me, his whole demeanor had changed. The careful politeness he'd shown round my family was gone, replaced by something raw and hungry that made me want to run. He told me to sit on the bed while he got ready, and I perched on the edge of that huge mattress like a bird ready to take flight. My hands were shaking so bad I had to clasp them together in my lap to keep them still. I could hear him moving around behind me, the rustle of clothes being removed, and my heart was beating so fast I thought it might burst right out of my chest. When he finally turned around, what I saw made me forget how to breathe. Augustus Hartwell was built like no man I'd ever seen or even imagined. The sight of him naked was so shocking, so overwhelming, that I actually gasped out loud and scooted backward on the bed until my back hit the headboard. He was enormous in a way that seemed almost inhuman, and the look on his face when he saw my reaction was one of dark satisfaction, like my fear was exactly what he'd been hoping for. But it wasn't just his physical presence that terrified me. It was the way he looked at me, like I was something he'd been waiting a very long time to possess. He moved toward the bed slowly, deliberately, and I realized that everything I'd feared about this moment was about to come true. What happened next lasted what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The pain was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, sharp and tearing and overwhelming. I bit down on my lip so hard I drew blood, trying not to cry out. But some sounds escaped anyway, whimpers and gasps that seemed to encourage him rather than generate any sympathy. Augustus seemed to take a particular pleasure in my distress, whispering things in my ear that made me feel sick and ashamed. He told me this was what I was made for, what I belonged to him for, and that I'd better get used to it, because this was going to be my life now. When it was finally over, I lay there feeling like something inside me had been broken beyond repair. Augustus rolled away from me and was asleep within minutes. Snoring softly like what had just happened was the most natural thing in the world. I stayed awake all night, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand how I was going to survive this. Every part of my body hurt, but the worst pain was in my heart. The understanding that this was just the beginning. This was going to be my life now, night after night, with a man who saw me as nothing more than property to be used however he pleased. But as the first gray light of dawn started creeping through those heavy curtains, I made myself a new promise. I was going to find a way to injure this, to survive whatever Augustus Hartwell planned to do to me. I wasn't going to let him break me completely, no matter how much he'd try. What I didn't know was that the worst was yet to come, and that by the end of the week, I'd discover something about my new husband that would make everything I'd already experienced seem like a gentle introduction to true horror. The first week of marriage taught me things about fear I never knew existed. Augustus had a routine, and I learned quickly that disrupting it in any way brought consequences I wasn't prepared for. He'd wake before dawn, dress in silence, and expect his breakfast on the table by the time he came downstairs. Coffee black as night, eggs over easy, bacon crisp but not burned. If anything was even slightly off, his mood would darken like storm clouds rolling in. But it wasn't just the perfectionist demands that wore me down. It was the way he'd watch me constantly, like he was studying me for something. He'd sit in his chair after dinner, newspaper in his hands, but his eyes following my every movement as I cleaned the kitchen. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at me with this strange, almost confused expression, like he was seeing someone else entirely. The house itself felt wrong, in ways I couldn't quite name. It was too quiet during the day when Augustus was out checking on his cattle, but it was the kind of quiet that made you feel like you weren't alone, like something was listening from the corners. The medicine smell was strongest in our bedroom, but I found traces of it throughout the house, in closets, behind doors, lingering in spaces where it shouldn't be. It was Miss Betty, the colored woman who came twice a week to help with the heavy cleaning, who first made me understand that I wasn't losing my mind. Betty had been working for Augustus for nearly 15 years, since before his first wife Carmen had left, and she knew things about this house that nobody else did. Betty was a small, weary woman with graying hair always pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that missed nothing. She moved through the house like someone who'd learned to be invisible, speaking only when spoken to. But I could feel her watching me with a mixture of pity and something else, recognition, maybe. It was during my second week in that house that Betty finally broke her silence. Augustus had gone to town for supplies, and I was in the kitchen trying to scrub a stain out of one of his shirts, when Betty appeared beside me with a cup of coffee I hadn't asked for. She set it down on the counter and stood there for a moment, like she was making up her mind about something important. Then she looked directly at me for the first time since I'd arrived and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. She told me that Carmen used to get those same bruises I was trying to hide with long sleeves and high neckline. She said Carmen had been young too when she married Augustus, maybe 19 or 20, and that in the beginning she tried to make the best of things just like I was doing. But then Betty said something that made my blood freeze in my veins. She told me that Carmen hadn't been Augustus's only wife. There had been another one, years before, a girl named Sarah, who lasted less than a year before she disappeared one winter night. Folks assumed she'd run off too, but Betty had her suspicion. The way Betty's hands shook when she told me this, I knew she was risking something just by talking to me. She explained that Augustus had a way of getting attached to young wives, but that attachment wasn't love. It was possession, pure and simple. And when that possession was threatened, or when the wives tried to assert any independence, things got dangerous fast. Betty warned me to be careful about mentioning my family or my old life, because Augustus didn't like to be reminded that his wives had existed before him. She said Carmen had made that mistake, talking about her sister in Memphis who kept writing letters, and that's when things had really started going downhill. But the most chilling thing Betty told me was about the basement. She said Augustus kept it locked at all times, and that sometimes at night she could hear sounds coming from down there. Not animal sounds, but something else. Something that made her skin crawl. She'd asked him about it once, years ago, and he'd gotten so angry that she'd never brought it up again. As Betty was gathering her cleaning supplies to leave that day, she pressed something into my hand. A small brass key that felt warm from being clutched in her palm. She told me it was a spare key to the back door, and that if I ever needed to get out of the house fast, I should know where to find it. She'd hidden it under the loose board on the back porch steps, third one from the top. After Betty left, I sat in that big, empty kitchen holding that key and trying to process what she'd told me. If there had been other wives who'd disappeared rather than just run away, then what I was dealing with wasn't just an abusive husband. It was something much more sinister. That night, Augustus came home from town in a particularly good mood, whistling that same tune and bringing me a bag of peppermint sticks from the general store. But instead of feeling grateful for this small kindness, I found myself studying his face, looking for signs of the darkness Betty had warned me about. It was while he was reading his paper after dinner that I noticed something I'd missed before. There was a ring of keys hanging from his belt, and one of them was different from the others, older, more ornate, like it belonged to something important. When I asked him about it, trying to sound casual, his whole body went rigid. He told me it was the key to his office in the barn, where he kept his important papers, and that I was never to go near that place. The way he said it wasn't a request or even a command. It was a threat, delivered in that soft, careful voice that I was learning to fear more than shouting. But I'd seen enough fear in his eyes when I asked about that key to know that whatever he was hiding wasn't just paperwork. Something was locked away in that barn office, something he was desperate to keep secret. And I had a terrible feeling it had to do with those other wives Betty had mentioned. As I lay in bed that night, listening to Augustus's steady breathing beside me, I realized I wasn't just trapped in a bad marriage. I was trapped in something much worse. And if I wanted to survive long enough to see my family again, I was going to have to be smarter and more careful than I'd ever been in my life. The question was whether I could figure out Augustus's secrets before they destroyed me, or if I was destined to become just another young wife who disappeared into the Tennessee hills, leaving behind nothing but whispered rumors and unanswered questions. 3 weeks into my marriage, I discovered something that made me question everything I thought I knew about my situation. It started with a letter that arrived on a Tuesday morning while Augustus was out mending fences in the far pasture. The mailman, old Mr. Henderson, handed it to me with a curious look, probably wondering why anyone would be writing to Mrs. Augustus Hartwell so soon after the wedding. The envelope was addressed in careful handwriting, and when I opened it, my hands started shaking so bad I nearly dropped it. It was from Carmen, Augustus's first wife, who was supposed to have run away years ago. But she wasn't writing from some distant city where she'd escaped to start a new life. She was writing from Mercy General Hospital in Nashville. And the words on that page turned my world upside down. Carmen explained that she'd been confined in the mental ward for the past 12 years, committed there by Augustus after what he'd called a nervous breakdown. But according to her letter, she hadn't had any breakdown. She'd tried to leave him, and when he'd caught her packing her things, he'd had her declared mentally unstable by a doctor friend of his. In those days, a husband's word was all it took to have a wife locked away indefinitely. The most terrifying part of her letter was the warning she gave me. She wrote that Augustus had a pattern, a sickness that made him obsessed with young wives. But that obsession always turned dangerous when the wives showed any sign of independence or tried to connect with their old life. She said she'd tried to keep in touch with her family after marrying him, and that's when he'd started talking about her being touched in the head. But Carmen revealed something else that made my stomach drop to my feet. She said Augustus had shown her photographs, pictures of Sarah, the wife before her, pictures that proved Sarah hadn't run away like everyone thought. Augustus had kept those photographs in a tin box hidden somewhere in the house. Photographs that showed what really happened to wives who tried to leave him. Carmen begged me to be careful, to never let Augustus know I'd received her letter, and to watch for signs that he was planning to have me committed to. She said the process was simple, a few visits from his doctor friend, some stories about erratic behavior, and a signature on commitment papers. Once a woman was locked away in Mercy General, she might as well be dead to the outside world. I burned that letter in the kitchen stove, but her words echoed in my head for days afterward. Every time Augustus looked at me strangely, every time he made one of his odd comments about my behavior, I wondered if he was building a case against my sanity. It was the following Saturday that I found the tin box Carmen had mentioned. Augustus had gone to town for his monthly meeting with the cattle buyers, a trip that usually kept him away for most of the day. I'd been cleaning our bedroom when I noticed that one of the floorboards near the window creaked, differently than the others. When I examined it more closely, I realized it was loose. Prying up, that board revealed a small space underneath, just big enough for a tin box about the size of a cigar container. My hands were shaking as I lifted it out and opened the lid, but nothing could have prepared me for what I found inside. There were photographs, just like Carmen had said, but they weren't just pictures of Sarah. There were pictures of me, dozens of them, taken without my knowledge over the weeks before our wedding. Pictures of me hanging laundry at my parents' house, walking to church, sitting under the oak tree where I used to meet Caleb. Augustus had been watching me for much longer than I'd realized, studying me like some kind of specimen. But the pictures of Sarah were what made me drop the box and scramble backward across the floor. They showed a young woman with blonde hair and frightened eyes, but she wasn't posing for these photographs. Some showed her tied to a chair in what looked like the basement. Others showed her in various states of undress and obvious distress. The final photograph in the sequence showed Sarah lying still and pale on what looked like a wooden table, her eyes closed and her skin having a waxy, unnatural appearance. Mixed in with the photographs were newspaper clippings about missing women from surrounding counties, women who had disappeared over the past 20 years. Some were wives who'd supposedly run away from their husbands. Others were young women who'd simply vanished without a trace. Augustus had collected these clippings like trophies and written notes in the margins about similarities he'd noticed between the missing women and his own wives. the bottom of the box was a journal written in Augustus's careful handwriting. The entries went back 15 years and detailed his observations about his wife's behavior, their attempts to assert independence, and his methods for correcting them. The most recent entries were about me, describing my reactions to various situations and rating my compliance level, like I was some kind of experiment. One entry, dated just 3 days before our wedding, made my blood run cold. Augustus had written about his plans for our marriage, how he intended to gradually isolate me from my family, and then begin the process of having me committed once I'd served his immediate purpose. He'd written about Carmen, and how successful that process had been. How convenient it was to have a wife locked away where she couldn't contradict his stories about what kind of woman she'd been. But the most chilling entry was the last one, written just 2 days after our wedding night. Augustus had recorded his disappointment that I wasn't responding appropriately to his methods, and that he might need to accelerate his timeline. He'd written about the basement, and how it had been useful for training Sarah, and how he was considering whether it might be necessary for me as well. I put everything back exactly as I'd found it and replaced the floorboard, but I knew I was running out of time. Augustus wasn't just an abusive husband. He was something much worse, something that had been perfecting his techniques for hurting women for decades, and I was just the latest in a long line of victims he'd selected and groomed for his particular brand of torture. That night, as Augustus sat reading his paper after dinner, I watched him with new eyes. Every time he looked up at me, every casual comment about my day or my behavior, I heard the echo of those journal entries. He was studying me, documenting my responses, preparing for the next phase of whatever nightmare he had planned. The worst part was pretending everything was normal, continuing to cook his meals and clean his house and submit to his demands, while knowing what he really was. But I also knew that my survival depended on not letting him see that anything had changed, not giving him any reason to suspect I'd discovered his secrets. As I lay in bed that night, listening to his breathing and feeling the weight of his arm across my body, I knew I was living on borrowed time. Soon, very soon, Augustus was going to decide that I'd outlived my usefulness as a compliant wife and move to the next phase of his plan. The question was whether I could find a way to escape before that happened, or if I was destined to end up like Sarah, just another collection of photographs in a tin box hidden under the floorboards. October came early that year, bringing with it a cold snap that made the house feel even more like a tomb. Augustus had been watching me more intently over the past few days, and I could feel the shift in his attention like a change in the weather. He'd started asking strange questions about my family, whether I missed them, whether I ever thought about visiting. Each question felt like a trap, and I tried to give answers that wouldn't trigger whatever he was planning. It was on a Thursday evening, exactly 6 weeks after our wedding, that everything came to a head. Augustus had been unusually quiet during dinner, picking at his food and stealing glances at me when he thought I wasn't looking. After I'd finished cleaning the dishes, he asked me to join him in the parlor, using a careful, controlled voice that always made my skin crawl. He'd set up 2 chairs facing each other in front of the fireplace, and when I sat down, he positioned himself so close that our knees were almost touching. His pale blue eyes had a strange intensity that I'd never seen before, and when he started talking, his voice had an odd, hypnotic quality that made me think of a snake charmer. Augustus began by telling me how much our marriage meant to him, how grateful he was to have found someone as young and pure as me to share his life. But there was something wrong with the way he said it, like he was reciting lines from a play he'd performed many times before. His hands moved constantly as he talked, adjusting his cuffs, smoothing his hair, touching the ornate key that hung from his belt. Then he started asking about my dreams, whether I'd been sleeping well, if I'd noticed any changes in my mood or behavior. The question seemed innocent enough, but I remembered Carmen's warning about Augustus building a case for commitment, and I realized this might be the beginning of that process. I told him I was sleeping fine, that I felt perfectly normal, but even as the words left my mouth, I could see him filing away my responses for future use. He nodded thoughtfully after each answer, sometimes making small humming sounds like he was considering something important. That's when he brought out the photographs. They weren't the ones from the tin box. These were different pictures, older ones showing women I didn't recognize. Augustus spread them out on the small table between our chairs like he was dealing cards, his movements deliberate and practiced. Each photograph showed a young woman, and they all had the same haunted look in their eyes that I'd been seeing in my own reflection. Lately, Augustus explained that these were women he'd known over the years, women who'd suffered from what he called nervous conditions that required special treatment. He talked about each one like he was discussing the weather, describing their symptoms and the various methods that had been used to help them. But the way he touched each photograph, the satisfaction in his voice when he talked about their treatments, made it clear that helping them hadn't been his motivation. One photograph in particular caught my attention. A young woman with dark hair and terrified eyes who looked familiar somehow. When I asked Augustus about her, his whole demeanor changed. His careful composure slipped for just a moment, and I saw something raw and hungry flash across his face. He told me her name was Rebecca, and that she'd been what he called a special case. She'd required more intensive treatment than the others, treatment that had taken place in a private facility he'd built specifically for such purpose. The way he said private facility made my stomach lurch, because I had a terrible feeling I knew exactly what he was talking about. Augustus gathered up the photographs and put them away, but not before I noticed that Rebecca's picture went into a different stack than the others. When I asked him what made her case so special, he smiled in a way that made every instinct I had screamed danger. He explained that Rebecca had been particularly resistant to conventional treatment, that she'd required what he called environmental therapy in a controlled setting. He'd had to design special accommodation for her, he said, somewhere she could be properly supervised and treated without the distractions of the outside world. That's when he stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the barn that sat about 50 yards from the house. In the gathering darkness, I could see a faint light glowing in one of the upper windows, a light I'd never noticed before. Augustus followed my gaze and nodded, like he was pleased I'd finally seen it. He told me that he still maintained his treatment facility, that it was important to be prepared for special cases that might arise. The way he looked at me when he said this left no doubt about what he meant. The facility was for me, and he was already planning when he might need to use it. But then Augustus said something that made my blood freeze completely. He mentioned that he'd received word that day about my old friend Caleb Winchester, that there had been an accident at the Murphy farm. Caleb had been found unconscious in one of the barns, badly injured, and currently in the hospital in town. The doctors weren't sure if he'd recover, Augustus said, but it was such a shame about young men who didn't know how to mind their own business. The way he delivered this news, with that same careful, controlled voice he'd used to discuss the photographs, made it clear that Caleb's accident had been anything but accidental. Augustus had gotten tired of waiting for me to forget my old life, so he decided to eliminate the parts of it that still held meaning for me. As we sat there in the flickering firelight, Augustus watching me absorb the news about Caleb, I realized that everything was accelerating much faster than I'd anticipated. He wasn't planning to wait months or even weeks to move to the next phase of his plan. He was preparing to use his treatment facility very soon, possibly within days. The light in the barn window seemed to pulse in the darkness, like a heartbeat or a warning signal. Whatever was in that building, whatever Augustus had prepared for me there, was ready and waiting. And from the way he kept glancing between me and that distant light, I knew my time was running out faster than sand through an hourglass. That night, as I lay rigid beside Augustus, feeling his satisfaction radiating from him like heat from a stove, I knew that everything was about to change. The careful game we'd been playing was almost over, and soon I'd discover exactly what had happened to Rebecca and Sarah and all those other women in the photographs. The only question left was whether I'd live long enough to tell anyone about it, or if I'd become just another picture in Augustus's collection, another success story in his private journal of women. Hood required his special brand of treatment, and in the morning, I was about to discover that my worst fears were just the beginning of what Augustus Hartwell had planned for me. I woke up Friday morning to the sound of Augustus moving around the bedroom earlier than usual, and when I opened my eyes, I saw him standing at the foot of the bed fully dressed, holding a cup of coffee and watching me with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't anger or even the cold calculation I'd grown accustomed to. It was anticipation, like a child on Christmas morning who knew exactly what present was waiting under the tree. He told me he had special plans for the day, that we were going to take a tour of his property so I could better understand the full scope of what he'd built over the years. The way he said full scope made my skin prickle, because I knew he wasn't talking about cattle or crops. He was talking about the barn, about whatever was waiting for me in that building with the glowing window. Augustus had prepared breakfast himself, something he'd never done before, and he watched me eat every bite with an intensity that made my throat close up. The eggs tasted like sawdust, and the coffee was bitter, but I forced myself to swallow everything because I knew this might be my last real meal for a very long time. After breakfast, he led me outside into the crisp October air, his hand firmly gripping my elbow like he was escorting a prisoner. We walked slowly across the yard toward the barn, and with each step, I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The morning mist was still rising from the fields, making everything look ghostly and unreal. Augustus talked as we walked, his voice taking on the tone of a tour guide, showing off his proudest achievement. He explained how he designed the barn himself, how he'd insisted on certain modifications that weren't standard for agricultural building. He'd had it built with extra thick walls for sound dampening, he said, and special ventilation systems for maintaining proper air quality in all weather conditions. When we reached the barn doors, Augustus pulled out that ornate key I'd noticed on his belt and unlocked them with ceremonial care. The hinges creaked as the doors swung open, revealing an interior that looked nothing like any barn I'd ever seen. The main floor had been divided into several rooms with proper walls and doors, and I could see electrical wiring running along the ceiling, unusual for a farm building in our area. But it was the stairs leading to the upper level that made my legs go weak. They were wooden, but well constructed, leading up to what Augustus called his special project rooms. He guided me toward those stairs with gentle pressure on my back, and I knew that whatever was waiting upstairs would change everything. The upper level had been converted into what looked like a combination of medical facility and prison. There were several small rooms with heavy doors, each one equipped with a small window and what appeared to be ventilation grates. Augustus showed me the first room with obvious pride, explaining how he designed it for maximum security while maintaining humane living conditions. but it was the largest room at the end of the hallway. That made me understand the true scope of his madness. It was set up like a makeshift hospital room, complete with restraints attached to a metal table and cabinets full of medical supplies. Augustus explained that this was where he conducted his most important research, studying the effects of isolation and controlled environments on the female mind. He talked about his work like it was legitimate scientific research, describing how he documented the psychological changes in his subjects over time. He showed me charts and graphs tracking what he called behavioral modifications, and photographs documenting the physical effects of his treatments. Looking at those images, seeing the progression from healthy young women to hollow-eyed, broken shells, I realized I was looking at a serial killer's trophy collection. That's when Augustus revealed the most horrifying truth of all. He told me that his first wife, Sarah, was still alive. She was in the smallest room at the far end of the hall and had been his guest for nearly 20 years. What everyone thought was her disappearance had actually been her transition to becoming his permanent research subject. He unlocked the door to show me, and what I saw inside that room will haunt me until the day I die. Sarah was sitting on a narrow cot, staring at the wall with empty eyes that didn't even register our presence. She'd aged decades in the years since her wedding photo, her blonde hair now completely gray, and her body thin to the point of frailty. She was alive, but everything that had made her human had been systematically destroyed. Augustus explained that Sarah represented his greatest success, a complete transformation from willful young wife to perfectly compliant subject. He said it had taken 3 years to achieve the breakthrough he was looking for, but that the results had been worth the effort. Sarah no longer had any memory of her life before the bond, no desires or opinions or thoughts beyond the basic need for survival. Standing there looking at what remained of Sarah, I realized that this was my future, not death, but something far worse. Augustus planned to keep me alive for decades, studying me, documenting my breakdown, perfecting his techniques for destroying the human spirit. I would become his next great success story. Another example of what could be achieved with enough time and the right methods. But as Augustus continued his tour, showing me the other rooms and explaining his plans for my treatment program, something inside me shifted. Maybe it was seeing Sarah and understanding that death would actually be a mercy compared to what awaited me. Or maybe it was the rage that had been building for weeks finally reaching a breaking point. Whatever it was, I made a decision standing in that horrible place. I wasn't going to become another Sarah, another broken doll in Augustus's collection. I was going to find a way to fight back, even if it killed me. I'd rather die as Clementine Foster than live as Augustus Hartwell's perfect subject. The question was how to fight a man who'd had 20 years to perfect his methods, who controlled every aspect of my environment, and had the law on his side. But as we walked back toward the house, Augustus still talking about his research and his plans for me, I started formulating the beginnings of a plan. It would be dangerous, probably suicidal, but it was the only chance I had to avoid Sarah's fate. And if I failed, if Augustus caught me before I could escape or get help, at least I'd go down fighting instead of slowly fading away in one of those terrible rooms. Tonight, I decided I was going to make my move because tomorrow might be too late. And I'd rather risk everything on one desperate gamble than spend the next 20 watching my soul die piece by piece in Augustus Hartwell's private hell. The only question was whether I had the courage to follow through when the time came, or if I'd lose my nerve and condemn myself to become another entry in his research journals. That night, I waited until Augustus's breathing settled into the deep, steady rhythm of sleep before I made my move. My heart was beating so loud I was sure it would wake him, but I forced myself to slide out of bed inch by inch, testing each movement to make sure the mattress didn't creak. The floorboards were my biggest enemy. I knew exactly which ones groaned under pressure from my weeks of careful observation. I'd hidden Betty's spare key in my shoe earlier that day, and I retrieved it now with hands that shook so badly I nearly dropped it twice. My plan was simple, but desperate. Get to the barn, find some evidence of what Augustus had been doing to those women, and somehow make it to town before he discovered I was gone. The sheriff might not believe me, but physical evidence would be harder to dismiss. The October night was bitter cold, and I hadn't dared to grab a coat for fear of waking Augustus. I crept across the yard in my nightgown and bare feet, the frost-covered grass cutting into my soles like tiny knives. The barn loomed ahead of me like a monument to evil, but I forced myself to keep moving toward it, using Augustus's own key that I'd stolen from his belt while he slept. I unlocked the barn doors and slipped inside. The darkness was absolute, but I'd brought matches from the kitchen and managed to light one without burning my fingers. The flame cast dancing shadows on the walls as I made my way toward the stairs, every shadow looking like Augustus coming to drag me back to the house. I climbed those stairs like I was ascending to my own execution, each step bringing me closer to the evidence I needed, but also deeper into the heart of Augustus's madness. The upper level was even more horrifying in the flickering matchlight, the medical equipment casting grotesque shadows, the locked doors hiding unspeakable secrets. It was when I reached Sarah's room that my plan fell apart completely. The door was standing open, and Sarah wasn't sitting on her cot where Augustus had shown her to me that morning. Instead, she was standing in the doorway, and when the matchlight hit her face, I saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Awareness, recognition, and something that might have been hope. She spoke to me in a voice like rustling leaves, so quiet I had to strain to hear her. She told me she'd been waiting for someone like me, someone young and strong enough to do what needed to be done. She said she'd been pretending to be broken for years, waiting for the right moment, the right person to help her end Augustus's reign of terror. Sarah explained that she'd discovered something about Augustus that even I didn't know. He wasn't just keeping women in this barn for his twisted research. He was selling them. There was a network of men like him, wealthy and connected, who traded in what they called special subjects. Some of the women in the photographs weren't just victims of Augustus's experiments. They were merchandise, sold to other collectors when Augustus grew tired of them. She led me to a hidden compartment in the wall of her room, a space she'd hollowed out over the years with a spoon stolen from her food tray. Inside were documents, letters, and photographs that proved Augustus was part of something much larger and more organized than I'd imagined. There were shipping records, payment receipts, and correspondence with men in other states who shared his particular interests. But the most damning evidence was a ledger book that detailed every woman who'd passed through this barn over the past 20 years. Some were marked as retained for research, others as transferred to associates, and a few were simply marked disposed of. Seeing my own name at the bottom of the most recent page, with a notation about my estimated breaking time and potential resale value, made my stomach turn inside out. Sarah told me there was more evidence hidden throughout the barn, photographs, documents, even recordings Augustus had made of his sessions with various subjects. She'd been collecting it all for years, waiting for someone who could help her get it to the authorities. But she also warned me that Augustus had allies in town, men who knew about his activities and protected him in exchange for certain considerations. That's when we heard the sound that made my blood freeze, the barn doors creaking open downstairs. Augustus had discovered I was missing, and he was coming for me. Sarah grabbed my arm with surprising strength and pulled me toward the back of the barn, where she showed me a window that could be opened from the inside. She'd been planning her own escape for years, but she'd never had the courage to take the final step. Now, with my arrival, she finally saw her chance. But as we prepared to climb out that window, Augustus's voice drifted up from the main floor, and what he said stopped us both cold. He wasn't alone. There were other voices, other men who'd come to help him deal with what he called his domestic situation. Sarah told me those voices belonged to men who'd bought women from Augustus before, men who had just as much to lose if his operation was exposed. We were trapped in that barn with evidence of decades of unspeakable crimes. But we were also surrounded by the very men who'd participated in those crimes. Getting out alive seemed impossible. But Sarah looked at me with eyes that had found their fire again after 20 years of darkness. She told me there was one more thing hidden in her room, something she'd been saving for exactly this moment. It was a can of kerosene and a box of matches. Not much, but enough to destroy the evidence if we couldn't escape with it. At least then, other women might be spared our fate. As the footsteps on the stairs grew closer and Augustus's voice called out my name, with false sweetness, Sarah and I made our choice. If we couldn't live as free women, we could at least die making sure that no one else would suffer in this place. But just as Sarah struck the first match, something happened that neither of us had expected. Something that would change everything and give us a chance we thought we'd lost forever. The sound of sirens filled the night air, getting closer by the second, and Augustus's confident voice suddenly turned to panic as he realized that his carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down around him. The sirens weren't what saved us that night. It was something far more unexpected and miraculous than any rescue I could have imagined. As Sarah held that lit match and we prepared to burn down 20 years of evidence, along with ourselves, Augustus appeared at the top of the stairs with 2 other men I didn't recognize. But instead of the cold, calculating monster I'd lived with for weeks, I saw something in his face that shocked me to my core. Genuine terror. And something that looked almost like relief. The men with him weren't there to help him dispose of us. They were federal agents who'd been tracking the human trafficking network for over 3 years. And Augustus had been working with them as an informant for the past 6 months. Everything I discovered, every piece of evidence Sarah had collected, Augustus had been secretly documenting and passing along to the authorities. It turned out that Augustus Hartwell wasn't the mastermind of this operation. He was its most tormented victim 23 years ago. These same men had kidnapped his younger brother Antonio and forced Augustus to watch as they tortured and killed him. They then threatened to do the same to his parents unless Augustus used his farm as a front for their activities. For over 2 decades, he'd been trapped in a nightmare of his own, forced to participate in horrors that destroyed his soul piece by piece. The medical equipment, the rooms, even his treatment of Sarah. It had all been an elaborate performance designed to convince the real criminals that he was one of them, while secretly gathering evidence for their eventual prosecution. Sarah herself had been in on the deception for the past 10 years, working with Augustus to document everything while pretending to be his broken victim. When Augustus saw the confusion and disbelief in my eyes, he broke down completely, through tears that seemed to come from the deepest part of his being. He told me how he'd tried to protect me by marrying me quickly, before the network could target me independently. He discovered they'd been watching me for months, planning to take me anyway. And his marriage proposal to my father had been a desperate attempt to keep me under his protection. But the most shocking revelation came when Augustus explained why he'd been so strange and distant, why he'd seemed to be to different people at once. He told me he'd been slowly poisoning himself with laudanum for years, trying to numb himself to what he was forced to participate in, but that he'd been trying to reduce the dose since our marriage, because he wanted to be clear-headed enough to protect me properly. That's when Sarah spoke up, her voice stronger now than it had been in years. She told me that everything I'd witnessed in our bedroom, all the pain and fear Augustus had caused me, had been as agonizing for him as it was for me. She said she'd watched him vomit after our wedding night, seen him pray and weep and beg God's forgiveness for what he was being forced to do to an innocent girl. The federal agents explained that they'd finally gathered enough evidence to arrest the entire network, but that they'd needed Augustus to maintain his cover until the very last moment. My escape attempt that night had actually triggered the final raid. Augustus had signaled them when he discovered I was missing, knowing that the operation was about to be exposed anyway. As the sun came up over that Tennessee farm, I watched as dozens of law enforcement officers led away the men who terrorized Augustus and countless women for decades. The barn was dismantled piece by piece, every document and photograph cataloged as evidence in what would become one of the largest human trafficking prosecutions in the state's history. But the most amazing part of this whole impossible story was what happened next. Augustus, finally free from the burden he'd carried for over 20 years, became the man he was meant to be all along. The cold, calculating presence I'd feared was replaced by someone gentle and broken and desperately trying to atone for the things he'd been forced to do. He insisted on divorcing me immediately, saying that what had been done to me in his name was unforgivable, even if it had been done under duress. He bought me a small house in town and gave me enough money to live independently while I decided what I wanted to do with my life. And when Caleb Winchester recovered from his injuries that had actually been inflicted by the trafficking network when they discovered he was asking too many questions about my marriage, Augustus personally apologized to him and gave his blessing for us to be together. It took 3 years for all the legal proceedings to conclude. 3 years for Augustus to rebuild his shattered soul with the help of Pastor Williams and the forgiveness of a community that slowly came to understand he'd been as much a victim as anyone else. And it was during those 3 years that the most beautiful thing happened. Carmen came home. She hadn't been in a mental institution all those years, but in hiding, protected by the same federal agents who'd been building their case. She'd been working with them from the beginning, and when she finally returned to Tennessee, she and Augustus were able to heal together in a way that seemed impossible, but was somehow exactly what both of them needed. At 25, I married Caleb Winchester in the same little church where I'd once thought my life was ending. And we built the family we dreamed about under that old oak tree. We had the beautiful children who grew up knowing the truth about courage and forgiveness, and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. Augustus and Carmen lived together for 20 peaceful years after that, and when he passed away at 72, he died knowing that God had used even his darkest moments for something good. He'd saved dozens of women by maintaining his cover, and his testimony had helped convict some of the most dangerous predators in the region. Today, at 72 myself, 9 grandchildren, and for great-grandchildren filling my house with laughter every Sunday, I look back on that terrible time and see God's hand in every moment of it, even in our darkest valleys, even when we can't see past our own pain and fear. The Lord is working all things together for good. If you're facing something that seems impossible to survive, something that feels like it might destroy you completely, I want you to remember my story. Remember that appearances can deceive, that people aren't always what they seem, and that sometimes the very thing that looks like your destruction might actually be your salvation in disguise. I'm still here in this little house that Augustus bought me all those years ago, still telling my story to anyone who needs to hear it. And I want to know, what city are you watching this from? I'd love to know where my words are reaching, where they might be bringing hope to someone who needs it most. If this old woman's tale has touched your heart, maybe you could help my voice travel even further. Help it find its way to other souls who need to know that no situation is hopeless, no darkness too deep for God's light to penetrate. Share my story, subscribe to hear more like it. Because, honey, I've got a lifetime of tales about the power of love to overcome even the most impossible circumstance. And trust me, if I can survive what I've been through and come out stronger on the other side, then whatever you're facing right now doesn't stand a chance against the strength the Lord has placed inside you.